3,000 ships came out of the dark side of the moon, and not one radio on Earth picked up a single warning. By the time the first city went dark, humanity had exactly 11 minutes to decide something no species had ever decided fast enough before. Somewhere in a bunker outside Colorado, a tired old general picked up a phone that hadn't rung in 40 years. What he said next would be repeated for the next 1,000 years of human history. But first, a circumflex euros, you need to understand exactly what we were up against. General Marcus Reyes hadn't slept in 2 days, and the red phone on his desk, a circumflex euros, the one nobody had touched since the Cold War ended, a circumflex euros, was ringing for the first time in his career. He almost didn't pick it up. Then the lights in the bunker flickered once, and every screen in the room lit up with the same impossible feed. Satellite imagery of 3,000 ships pouring out from behind the moon like a wound opening in the sky. "Sir," his aide said, voice shaking, "NORAD's confirming. This isn't a drill. This isn't ours." Reyes picked up the phone. On the other end, a voice that had been translated through some kind of alien processor spoke in flat, emotionless English. "This is Warlord Kryven of the Ashen Fleet. Your world has been selected for harvest. You have 11 minutes to submit your surrender terms before the process begins." Reyes didn't say anything for a long moment. Behind him, his team was already scrambling a circumflex euros, pulling up defense grids that everybody knew, deep down, weren't built for this. Nobody built missile defense systems for 3,000 ships. "Harvest," Reyes finally said. "That's a hell of a word to use for genocide." "Semantics," Kryven's voice replied, cold as space itself. "The Ashen Fleet has harvested 206 worlds. Every species submits eventually. Yours will be no different." 206. Reyes felt that number land like a physical weight. 206 civilizations, gone, folded into whatever the Ashen Fleet called their empire. And now it was Earth's turn, with 11 minutes on a countdown clock that felt like it was mocking every plan humanity had ever made for this exact nightmare. "You've got the wrong number for surrender terms," Reyes said quietly. There was a pause on the line. "Explain." "This is the number for a country that's been fighting itself for 250 years and still hasn't quit," Reyes said. "You want a surrender hotline, you called the wrong planet." He hung up. For 3 full seconds, the bunker was dead silent, a circumflex euros, the kind of silence that comes right before everyone realizes exactly how much trouble they're in. Then Reyes turned to his aide. "Get me every branch of every military on this planet on one line. Right now. And somebody find out what the hell harvest actually means, because I don't like the sound of it one bit." Outside, across every time zone on Earth, 3,000 ships began their slow, silent descent a circumflex euros, and 11 minutes started ticking down toward a fight nobody on either side had ever seen coming. The answer came in fast, and it was worse than anyone imagined. Dr. Elena Vasquez, an astrophysicist, pulled out of bed at 3 a.m. and rushed into the Colorado bunker still wearing mismatched socks, was the one who finally cracked it. She'd spent 6 years studying anomalous signals from deep space a circumflex euros, signals everyone else had dismissed as noise. Turns out they weren't noise. They were echoes, distress calls from worlds that no longer existed. "Harvest doesn't mean conquest," Elena said, hands shaking as she pulled up the data on the main screen. "It means extraction. They don't want our land. They don't want our resources, not really. They strip a planet's population a circumflex euros, every living mind a circumflex euros, and convert it into processing power for their fleet's core systems. 206 worlds, general. 206 entire civilizations turned into batteries for their war machine." The room went cold. "How long does it take?" Reyes asked. "Based on the size of their fleet," Elena said, voice barely steady, "and the population of Earth, they're estimating full extraction in 6 hours. 6 hours, not years, not months. 6 hours to turn 8 billion people into fuel for an empire that had already done this 206 times before without a single failure." Reyes felt something harden in his chest a circumflex euros, the kind of resolve that doesn't come from confidence, but from having absolutely nothing left to lose. "Then we've got 6 hours to prove we're number 207 going different," he said. Word spread fast after that call went out to every military base on the planet. But it wasn't just militaries that mobilized. Something happened in those first 20 minutes that the Ashen Fleet's tacticians acircumflex Euros, who had studied the fall of 206 species acircumflex Euros, had never once accounted for. Ordinary people started moving too. In Detroit, a National Guard unit found itself joined by 300 factory workers who showed up with whatever tools they had, ready to fight with pipe wrenches if that's what it took. In Mumbai, a formerly retired fighter pilot walked back onto an airbase runway she hadn't seen in 15 years and demanded a jet. In a small farming town in Nebraska, a father loaded his hunting rifle, kissed his kids goodbye, and told them, "Daddy's just going to go make sure the sky stays ours." Warlord Kryven, watching all this unfold from his command ship, felt something he hadn't felt in 3 centuries of conquest: the faintest, most unfamiliar flicker of doubt. The first ships touched down outside Denver, and within minutes, the Ashen Fleet learned something no other conquered world had ever managed to teach them. Humans don't wait for permission to fight back. An advanced scout squad acircumflex Euros, 6 armored soldiers, easily capable of leveling a city block on their own acircumflex Euros, moved through the outskirts expecting the usual pattern: panic, fleeing crowds, easy extraction targets. Instead, they walked into an ambush laid by a combined force of Colorado National Guard, 3 off-duty SWAT units, and roughly 40 armed civilians who'd organized themselves in less time than it took the aliens to land. The fight lasted 4 minutes. 3 of the 6 scouts didn't make it back to their ship. It was the first Ashen Fleet casualties in over 150 years. Kryven received the report in his command chair, and for the first time since taking his position, he stood up. "Casualties," he repeated slowly, like the word itself was foreign. "On a harvest run." "Yes, Warlord," his lieutenant said, clearly nervous. "The local resistance was coordinated, faster than projected. They didn't scatter. They organized within minutes of first contact." Kryven had conquered 206 worlds by exploiting exactly one universal truth: fear fractures societies. Every species, faced with overwhelming force, eventually turned on itself acircumflex Euros. Leaders fled. Populations panicked. Resistance crumbled from the inside before the Ashen Fleet even needed to finish the job. Earth wasn't doing that. Across the planet, similar reports were flooding in. In Poland, farmers and soldiers fought side by side using decades-old equipment against alien tech that should have made the fight a slaughter acircumflex Euros, and somehow held a defensive line for 20 full minutes. In South Korea, an entire city coordinated a blackout and ambush that took down 2 scout ships using nothing but old anti-air batteries and sheer stubborn coordination. In Texas, acircumflex Euros, and Kryven's analysts flagged this report specifically, still confused by data streaming in from a strange incident weeks earlier involving a supposedly unstoppable bioweapon, and something called brisket, acircumflex Euros. Local militias were reportedly organizing supply lines faster than any collective logistics unit ever had. "They're not panicking," Kryven said, staring at the tactical map lighting up with pockets of resistance across every continent. "They're rallying." His lieutenant said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. For the first time in 3 centuries, Warlord Kryven felt his 11-minute deadline start to feel less like a formality and more like a mistake. Somewhere in that 6-hour countdown, the numbers had already started shifting acircumflex Euros, and not in the Ashen Fleet's favor. Reyes hadn't slept in over 40 hours, and his coffee had gone cold 3 refills ago, but the war room around him was buzzing with something he hadn't felt in years of quiet peacetime service: momentum. "Talk to me," he said, eyes fixed on the tactical board. "Every branch is mobilized," his aide reported. "NATO's coordinating with us in real time. Russia, China, India acircumflex Euros, everybody's set aside every disagreement they've ever had. We've got a joint command structure, standing up faster than anybody thought possible." Reyes allowed himself the smallest, grimmest smile. Leave it to an alien invasion to finally get every government on the planet to actually work together. "Casualties on their side?" he asked. "Confirmed losses in 6 engagements so far," Elena reported from her station, still running numbers nonstop. "Their tech is superior, General, there's no getting around that." But their tactics assume total societal collapse on contact. They're not built for coordinated resistance. Every time we hit back organized, it costs them more than their models expected. Reyes nodded slowly, the shape of a plan forming. Then we stop fighting like 200 separate countries, he said, and we start fighting like one species that's finally, for once, on the same side. Within the hour, Operation Homeground was underway circumflex Euros, a coordinated global defense combining every military asset on the planet with something Kryven's forces had never once accounted for: civilian ingenuity. Engineers repurposed satellite arrays into makeshift disruption fields. Amateur radio operators, tech companies, and hobbyist hackers banded together to crack Ashen Fleet communication frequencies within 3 hours flat. Farmers in a dozen countries used crop-dusting planes, loaded with improvised chaff, to blind alien sensor arrays during 2 separate ground assaults. None of it was elegant. None of it followed any military doctrine that existed before that day. It was messy, improvised, and stitched together out of pure human stubbornness circumflex Euros, and it was working. Kryven, watching his carefully planned 6-hour harvest stretch past its deadline with barely a fraction of the planet's population secured, finally did something the Ashen Fleet's official war doctrine strictly forbade. He called for reinforcements. It was an admission, buried in a coded transmission back to the Ashen homeworld, that a species his own analysts had rated as primitive, fractured, and non-threatening, was somehow still standing 4 hours into what should have been an effortless extraction. Reyes, watching the tactical map shift in humanity's favor for the first time since the ships appeared, allowed himself one more grim, tired smile. "They called for backup," he said. "Good. Means we're actually scaring them." Victory, if that's even the right word for it, was never going to be free circumflex Euros, and by hour 5, that truth had settled hard over every command center on the planet. The reports coming in weren't just numbers anymore. They were names. Reyes had personally signed off on notifications for 11 soldiers from the Denver engagement alone. Somewhere in Nebraska, that father who'd kissed his kids goodbye wasn't coming home, and somebody was going to have to tell his family that the sky had cost more than anyone wanted to pay. Elena found Reyes alone in a side room during a rare 5-minute lull, staring at a growing list of casualty reports that seemed to stretch endlessly across the screen. "You okay?" she asked, immediately realizing how stupid the question sounded given everything happening. "No," Reyes said honestly, "but that's not the part that matters right now." He turned to face her, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, she saw something raw underneath the general's composure circumflex Euros. Not doubt about the fight, but the weight of every decision that had sent people out to die for a species that hadn't even asked to be tested this way. 206 worlds, Reyes said quietly. "You know what I keep thinking about? Every one of those worlds probably had people just like us. People who loved their kids, argued over stupid things, made barbecue on Saturdays. And they lost every single time." "We're not losing," Elena said. "Not yet," Reyes agreed. "But we're paying for every inch of not losing, and I don't get to pretend that cost isn't real just because the alternative is worse." Outside the bunker, across a planet still very much in the fight, that same cost was being paid in 1,000 different ways circumflex Euros. Soldiers, civilians, first responders, ordinary people who'd picked up whatever they had and stood in the way of something built to erase them without hesitation. Cities had scars now that would take generations to heal, regardless of how the next few hours played out. But something else was happening too, something Kryven's fleet still hadn't fully processed, even as their own reinforcement ships began their slow approach from beyond the outer planets. Humanity wasn't just fighting. They were adapting in real time, sharing tactics across borders and languages faster than any species the Ashen Fleet had ever harvested. Every failed alien strategy got studied, dissected, and countered within the hour. Every human loss got turned, however painfully, into information that made the next defense stronger. Reyes wiped his eyes, squared his shoulders, and walked back out into the war room. "All right," he said, voice steady again despite everything. "Let's go finish this the right way circumflex Euros together, and for every single name on that list." Aboard his command vessel, Warlord Kryven stood in front of the tactical display, watching his 3-century record of flawless conquest crumble in real time across a single, stubborn planet. His reinforcements were still 2 hours out. His scout forces had lost more assets in 5 hours than in the previous 4 harvests combined. And worst of all, his own analysts were now reporting something deeply unsettling. Human resistance wasn't weakening as casualties mounted, it was strengthening. "Explain this to me again," Kryven said to his lead strategist, voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Every species we've harvested eventually fractures under pressure. Leadership collapses. Populations turn on each other. Why does this world do the opposite?" The strategist, a wiry officer named Fessa who'd survived long enough under Kryven's command to know honesty was safer than flattery, chose her words carefully. "Warlord, I believe. Their history conditioned them for this. Every record we've pulled shows a species that has fought itself for millennia a circumflex euros. Wars, disasters, division after division. But every time, when faced with something greater than their internal conflicts, they set those conflicts aside and unify. We didn't invade a fractured world. We invaded a species that has spent its entire history training for exactly this moment without ever knowing it." Kryven said nothing for a long moment, staring at reports of coordinated defense grids spanning 6 continents, built in hours out of tools no other conquered species had ever thought to combine this way. "And the reinforcement fleet from the homeworld," he finally said. "How long until full engagement?" 90 minutes, Warlord." Kryven turned back to the display, watching human forces regroup and reposition with a coordination that should have taken this fractured, disorganized species years to develop, not hours. For the first time in 300 years, the warlord of the Ashen Fleet felt something dangerously close to fear a circumflex euros. Not for his fleet's tactical position, though that was concerning enough, but for what it meant if a message got back to the Ashen homeworld that a single unconquered world had cost this much blood and still hadn't broken. 206 worlds had taught the collective's war doctrine one lesson above all others: overwhelming force plus patience always wins. Nobody had ever accounted for a species that simply refused the entire premise. "Reroute all remaining scout forces to defensive posture," Kryven finally ordered, voice quieter than his officers had ever heard it. "We hold position until reinforcements arrive. No further ground engagements until we understand exactly what we're truly facing here." It was, though none of his officers dared say it aloud, the closest thing to a retreat order the Ashen Fleet had issued in over a century. Reyes used every one of those 90 minutes like they were the last 90 minutes anyone would ever get. Global command had shifted from scattered defense to something far more dangerous: preparation. Every scrap of intelligence gathered from 5 hours of brutal fighting got fed into a single, unified strategy, built jointly by military commanders who, 12 hours earlier, had been rivals, and by civilian engineers who'd never worn a uniform in their lives. "Their reinforcement fleet is going to hit with everything they've got," Reyes said, addressing the largest coordinated command call in human history a circumflex euros, every major military and government leader on the planet, listening in real time. "They're done underestimating us. That means we're done getting the luxury of surprising them twice." Elena's voice cut through the call, steady despite the exhaustion clearly wearing on her. "We've got one advantage they still don't understand. Their tactical AI is built to counter organized military resistance a circumflex euros, formations, chains of command, predictable doctrine. It's not built to counter improvisation. Every time we've won today, it's because we did something their models never accounted for." "So we keep doing that," said a voice from South Korea's Joint Command. "We stop trying to fight them like a conventional war. We fight them like the mess we actually are." It became, in the final 90 minutes before Ashen reinforcements arrived, the strangest and most effective military strategy ever assembled a circumflex euros. A patchwork of civilian ingenuity and military precision, built on the simple, powerful truth that humanity's greatest weapon had never been its weapons at all. It was its refusal to fight the same way twice. Fishing fleets were repurposed as mobile decoy networks. Amateur drone hobbyists built swarms that overwhelmed alien targeting systems designed for conventional aircraft. A group of teenagers in Seoul, of all people, cracked an encryption pattern in Ashen communications that military cryptographers had been stuck on for hours, simply because they approached it like a video game puzzle instead of a battlefield problem. Reyes watched all of it converge into something he could only describe, in the privacy of his own exhausted mind, as beautiful acircumflex Euros. Not because it was clean or perfect, but because it was unmistakably, stubbornly human. With 11 minutes left before the Ashen reinforcement fleet arrived, Reyes stood in front of the assembled global command and said the only thing that felt true enough to say. 206 worlds fell because they fought alone, scared, and divided. We're not any of those things anymore. Whatever happens in the next few hours acircumflex Euros, we face it as one planet, or we don't face it at all. Across the world, in bunkers and command posts and makeshift defense lines built from nothing but courage and improvisation, humanity braced for the fight that would decide everything. They came in silent, the way the first wave had acircumflex Euros, 300 additional warships, sleeker and deadlier than anything that had touched down before, carrying enough firepower to level continents if Kryven gave the order. But this time, Earth wasn't caught off guard. Every radar array, every repurposed satellite, every jury-rigged detection system built in the last 5 hours picked up the fleet the moment it crossed the moon's orbit, and within seconds, coordinated defense grids across 6 continents shifted into their final configuration. Kryven, standing at the head of his combined fleet, felt something almost like respect creeping into the edges of his fury as he watched Earth's defenses respond. With a speed and precision that should have been impossible for a species his own reports had called disorganized just 12 hours earlier. All forces, he commanded, converge on primary population centers, overwhelming force. End this before it costs us anything further. What followed was the largest battle in human history, fought simultaneously across every continent, in skies and streets that had never seen anything like it acircumflex Euros, and wouldn't again for as long as anyone could imagine. Fighter jets that should have been hopelessly outclassed found gaps in Ashen formations, using tactics no alien AI had modeled. Ground forces, reinforced by civilians who refused to stop fighting even as exhaustion and grief mounted, held lines that tactical projections said should have collapsed hours earlier. And in the skies above what used to be Colorado, something happened that neither side fully expected. A coordinated strike, built from the combined intelligence of 100 different countries, working as one for the first time in recorded history, targeted the one weakness Alina's team had found buried in Ashen Fleet communications acircumflex Euros. A synchronization pulse that, if disrupted at exactly the right moment, would scatter their entire coordinated targeting network for critical, precious minutes. It worked. For 4 minutes, the most advanced fleet in the known galaxy fought completely blind, ships firing on outdated coordinates, defense grids scrambling to reroute around chaos that should never have been possible against a primitive species. 4 minutes was all humanity needed. Ground forces surged. Fighter squadrons that had been holding defensive lines all day pushed forward with everything they had left. And in the command bunker outside Colorado, Reyes watched the tactical map shift, hold, and finally acircumflex Euros. For the first time since the countdown began acircumflex Euros, tipped decisively in humanity's favor. "Sir," his aide said, voice breaking with disbelief, "their fleet formation is collapsing. They're pulling back." Reyes allowed himself, for the first time in nearly 24 impossible hours, to breathe. Kryven stood alone on his command deck, staring at a tactical display that told a story his 300 years of conquest had never prepared him to read. Casualty projections that should have shown total victory hours ago instead showed something his own people had never once recorded in Ashen Fleet history: a harvest operation on the verge of complete failure. Reinforcement losses had exceeded every previous campaign combined. His original scout force was reduced to a fraction of its strength. And worse, far worse than any material loss, was the message quietly working its way back toward the Ashen homeworld acircumflex Euros. A message that would tell every world still watching, every species still deciding whether resistance was worth attempting, that Earth had made the Ashen Fleet bleed and kept fighting anyway. "Warlord," Fessa said quietly, approaching with the kind of caution reserved for delivering news that couldn't be softened. If we continue this engagement, projections show total fleet losses exceeding 60% within the hour. The population resistance isn't weakening, it's compounding. Every hour we stay, they adapt faster than we can counter. Kryven's claws pressed white against the edge of his command console. 3 centuries of unbroken conquest, and this single, stubborn, impossibly unified world was about to end that record in a single day. He had 2 choices, and both of them tasted like poison. Stay and risk losing his entire fleet to a species that had somehow turned humanity's oldest weakness acircumflex Euros, its endless capacity for conflict acircumflex Euros, into its greatest strength the moment a threat greater than itself appeared. Or retreat and carry back to the Ashen homeworld the first true defeat in the collective's recorded history. He thought of the 206 worlds that had fallen before this one acircumflex Euros, worlds that had panicked, fractured, and surrendered exactly the way his doctrine predicted every species eventually would. He thought of the scout report from weeks earlier, the one about the bioweapon that had gone missing in Texas, last seen guarding a backyard full of humans over something as absurd as smoked meat. He understood now, with a clarity that felt almost like grief for his own broken certainty, exactly what that report had actually been warning him about. This species didn't fracture under pressure. It bonded. "Signal full retreat," Kryven finally said, voice hollow in a way his officers had never heard before. "Log the engagement as a strategic reassessment, not a defeat." Fessa hesitated, then nodded, understanding the lie for exactly what it was acircumflex Euros, the only version of the truth a 300-year record of conquest could survive intact. Across the tactical display, 300 Ashen warships began their slow, humiliating climb back toward the edge of the solar system, leaving behind a battered, exhausted, unbroken planet that had done what 206 worlds before it never managed. It had survived. Dawn broke over a planet that looked, in 1,000 small and enormous ways, completely different than it had 24 hours earlier. Reyes stood outside the bunker for the first time in over a day, watching the sun rise over Colorado, and felt the weight of everything acircumflex Euros. The names, the losses, the impossible, exhausting victory acircumflex Euros settle into something he suspected would take the rest of his life to fully carry. Alina joined him, coffee in hand, equally hollowed out and equally quietly amazed. "We actually did it," she said, like she still couldn't quite believe the words. "We did," Reyes said, "together. First time in human history, every single country on this planet fought the exact same fight, side by side, without a single one of us asking what was in it for us." Across the globe, the reports kept coming in acircumflex Euros, not of continued attack, but of recovery. Cities counting their losses and beginning, immediately and stubbornly, to rebuild. World leaders who'd spent decades at odds now speaking daily, bound by something no treaty had ever managed to create: the shared, unforgettable memory of standing together against annihilation and refusing to break. 206 worlds had fallen before Earth. Every one of them, according to Alina's research, had faced the exact same choice humanity faced in those first 11 minutes acircumflex Euros: submit or resist alone and fail. Earth had found a third option nobody else ever had. It hadn't resisted alone. Millions of light years away, on a homeworld that hadn't seen failure in 3 centuries, a defeated warlord filed a report that would ripple through the Ashen Fleet's war doctrine for generations to come acircumflex Euros. A warning, quietly whispered from commander to commander, about a small, stubborn blue planet on the edge of an unremarkable galaxy. Leave that world alone. It doesn't break, it bonds. Back on Earth, 6 months later, a memorial stood in Washington, D.C., inscribed with the names of everyone lost in what history would eventually just call the first night acircumflex Euros. A night that started with 11 minutes on a countdown clock and ended with an entire species discovering, all at once, exactly what it was capable of when it finally stopped fighting itself. Reyes visited that memorial every year for the rest of his life, and every year he said the same thing to the names carved into that stone. "We're still here," he'd say quietly, "because of you. All of you." And somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, a warning kept spreading through collective space, told and retold among species who'd learned, the hard way, exactly which planet not to test twice. They don't run. They don't fracture. And whatever you send against them a circumflex euros, they'll turn it into the reason they finally stood together.